All right, so let's begin at the beginning. The question is, where does the archaeological level begin? That's what that word. Kind of hard to see it on the screen there, but this is the $64,000 question. If you were going to take a course, if you were going to teach a course in Old Testament archaeology, where do you even begin in the archaeological record? Or where does the archaeological record actually begin? This is a very important question. It may seem like sort of a benign question, but it's really a fundamental question because it hinges upon certain assumptions, which we'll talk about here in just a second. But where does the archaeological level begin? And let me, before we get to the next step we're gonna take, let me say what archaeology is. Let me clarify what archaeology is in distinction with history. History studies the past by looking at written records. So we're talking about papyrus manuscripts, we're talking about clay tablets, anything that is anything that has writing on it. So historians reconstruct the past primarily by looking at historical text, whereas an archaeologist is a historian, but we study the past by looking at artifacts. So it's not to say that archaeologists are not interested in historical inscriptions. It's just that technically speaking, to be really technical, archaeology studies the past by looking at artifacts that humans have left behind. And the other thing, before we begin too, and I don't have a slide for this, is this, and that is, what is history? That's a really foundational question. Let me just start with the word itself. The word history comes from the Greek word historia, which was, I don't know if it's coined by him, but certainly first used by him, the Greek writer Herodotus, who wrote a book called the Histories. And the word history in the Greek literally means investigation. It doesn't mean myth, it doesn't mean story, it doesn't mean anything else, it means investigation. So, but when it comes to scholarship, how do today modern scholars, how do your professors look at history? And that was where the historical record begins. And what artifacts do we, now I'm not asking about the Bible, but I'm asking what actual physical artifacts do we have of historical writing? So when I talk about primeval history, what I'm talking about is the time before we actually have physical writing. Does everybody understand what I'm talking about there? Does that make sense? So primeval history would be, if we were going to overlay that over in the first chapters of Genesis, that would be the creation all the way to the flood, and even after the flood, possibly a little bit of time after the flood. Now, here's the question. Here's the big question that is sort of, we're going to take us to the next level. And that is this: was there a flood? Because depending on how you answer this question will then determine where you see the archaeological record begin. Because if the flood was local, if it was a localized flood in Mesopotamia, then the archaeological record is going to be a result of slow, gradualistic human evolutionary changes that humans basically evolved from simple-celled creatures all the way through the higher primates, and then eventually developed into advanced civilizations through Homo sapiens sapiens. But if there was a global flood that destroyed everything on the face of the earth, then where the archaeological record begins takes on a different color, if that makes sense. So let me just say at the outset here what I'm going to be talking about tonight and what I'm going to defend tonight. And then I'm also going to sort of make some clarifications about my view, because I don't want you to misunderstand where I'm coming from. I personally hold to a global catastrophic flood, but I'm not necessarily a young earth creationist as they define themselves. Now, as probably typical scholarship would define me, they would consider me a young earth creationist. Although, here's the thing, I'm just not dogmatic about the age of the earth. I'm not going to plant my flag in the age of the earth or in any kind of dates. And when you get back in this far, and here's the thing, this is not a question of archaeology now. Archaeology, again, as I've defined it, is a study of artifacts. When you're talking about the flood, that's not artifacts. That's a geological event. That's something that you have to use the principles of geology to try to ascertain if there was a global flood or not. So, so again, I'm not necessarily committed. I mean, it could be young. In fact, I do think it's younger than most typical scholars, paleontologists and geologists say that it is, but I'm not dogmatic that it's like 4,000 or 6,000. Does that make sense? It could be older than that, but to me, that is a question that we should bracket and set aside, and that's an important question, but we shouldn't plant our flag in a date. But that being said, I do think that what we're going to look at tonight, some of the evidence, does point to evidence that the Earth is a lot younger than we might think it is. Now, it could be still millions of years old, but the flood is a fairly recent event in Earth's history, if that makes sense. So we're going to talk about that. So not only that, we do have, when the historical record begins, as soon as humans began to write, what do they record? They record accounts of a great flood. In fact, the earliest historical writings that we have, the memory is of a great flood, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. So there are local flood arguments and there are global flood arguments. All the arguments, let me just say, and we don't have time to talk about all of them tonight, but let me just say that both views, both local flood arguments as well as global flood arguments, both have their problems. They have strengths and they have weaknesses. The weakness I would call an anomaly. These are, an anomaly would be evidence or data that doesn't really fit into the model. And so both views have strengths and weaknesses. I just think that the global flood has the greater evidence behind it, in my view. Again, not committed to that it has to be 6,000 years old. It could be. So without further ado, let me just start out. And I want to give you guys a conventional dating. This is what I'm about to give you are the dates that are agreed upon by the majority of scholars working in the ancient Near East of the earliest periods of humanity. And these dates are agreed on, again, by most scholars. This is conventional dating of Mesopotamian periodization, which is where the archaeological record begins. That's where we first see human remains or human artifacts, as we see them in Turkey, in the Tigris and Euphrates headwaters, all the way up into Armenia, or rather Asia Minor, Turkey, modern day Turkey, all the way down into Mesopotamia. So let's look at these dates. The first date that scholars look at when you look at the early periods of the Earth's history is the lower Paleolithic. Paleo meaning old lithic Stone Age, the old Stone Age, 300,000 to 80,000 BC is the date they assign to that. You've got the middle Paleolithic that ranges from 80 to 30,000 BC. The upper Paleolithic, 30,000 to 12,000 / 11,000, give or take a few years. The Mesolithic, or the period called the Epipaleolithic, 12,000 to 9,000 BC. Then we begin to see pottery. So those first ages, the first 4 ages, the Paleolithic and the Epipaleolithic, this is a fairly long period of time. There is human habitation. There are humans. They're not building cities, but they are living in caves. They are using stone tools, okay? That's known about. And this would be approximately when Neanderthals would have lived. And this would have been when we find cave paintings, such as we find in France at Lascaux and other parts of the world. We're going to talk about another discovery that was found a couple of decades ago in the Italian Alps. They found a man from the Paleolithic, or the Neolithic rather. I think it was, I don't know if it was pre-pottery. The dates change on him, so that's why I'm not sure about it. But it was a guy from the Stone Age. They found a human body in the Italian Alps from the Stone Age, and he was perfectly preserved. His skin was still intact. His stomach contents were still intact. He was frozen in a glacier on mountains in the Italian Alps. And they gave his name Otzi, the Iceman. We'll talk about that. So the pre-pottery Neolithic, so this is right at the beginning of pottery making. All right, hang on one second. I'm getting a little bit of, this happens sometimes. My thing will freeze up. So sorry about that. What's happening? So much information here. It just had to overload. All right. Let me see if I can escape out of here. Where'd it go? Come on. Come on, computer. There it goes. So we have, yeah, there it goes. I got it kicked off. I was getting worried there. So pre-pottery Neolithic A, they kind of subdivide this into two different branches, pre-pottery A and pre-pottery Neolithic B. And then you have the Ubaid period, which is a very well known about period in Mesopotamia, that's 6,000 to 4,000 BC. Then we have something called the Uruk period, 4,000 to 3,000 BC, and that's broken up also into three other phases: the early, the middle, and the late Uruk. And it is in the late Uruk where history begins. History begins in the late Uruk. So that shows you that there was quite a long period of time in which we don't, I mean, it's not to say that humans didn't have writing, we just have no evidence of it. There's no physical archaeological evidence of human writing before this time period. It's not until humans began to settle into cities in Mesopotamia that they begin to slow down and to begin to practice agriculture and live in cities that we see writing begin. And this happens at the Uruk expansion, which actually, we'll talk about this also, is when I believe the Tower of Babel. This is the beginnings of the Tower of Babel, the Uruk expansion. Then you've got the Jimdit Nasser period that comes after that, 3,000 to 2,900 BC. And then we enter into a period in Mesopotamia called the early dynastic period, 2,900 to 2,300 BC. Early dynastic. And this time period is really interesting to me because this is when in Mesopotamia, and when I say Mesopotamia, what I mean is the land between the rivers. And the rivers are the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that run in modern day Iraq. So the Tigris would be in the north. They run sort of northwest to southeast in a southeasterly direction, and they empty out into the Persian Gulf. The headwaters are all the way up into Turkey, and they empty out into the headwaters, again, of the Persian Gulf. And so anyway, this is where humans began to settle down and build cities. And in fact, the earliest city that we know of, true city, is a city called Eridu, or Eridu. And it's found in the lower Mesopotamia in southeastern Iraq, just a few kilometers from the site of Ur of the Chaldees. It actually predates Ur by several centuries. It's the earliest city in the world. Is called Eridu. And guess what? This is where the Uruk expansion centers on. When we look at all the arrows, you're going to see this in a moment. I'm going to show you this. This is where we believe the Tower of Babel was located, in Eridu, not in Babylon. Babylon's much later, because in Genesis chapter 10 or 11, we read about God confounding the builders of the tower and confounding their language, and they spread out. And we see this in the archaeological record in the late Uruk expansion. In the dynastic period, we also have subdivided into early dynastic 1, 2, 3, A and B. And the, let me go back. In the early dynastic 3B period, it's also known as the early Akkadian period, then the Akkadian Empire. The early Akkadian period is really interesting. There was a king by the name of Sargon the Great, or Sargon the First, who lived from 2320 to 2265 BC. And I believe, as well as some of my colleagues believe, that Sargon is the biblical person of Nimrod, mentioned in Genesis chapter 10. He united the Sumerian and Akkadian speaking peoples. And we know that Sargon and Nimrod both built great empires. And when we read the biblical characteristics of Nimrod, and when you look at the historical inscriptions about Sargon, they match perfectly. And he's also connected to some other things as well. So there's some pretty good circumstantial evidence that Nimrod, mentioned in Genesis, is none other than Sargon the Great, Sargon the first empire builder in history. A couple other kings in the early Akkadian period. I'm not going to give you all of them. Rimush, Man-Ishtushu, and Naram-Sin, 2241 to 2185 BC. Another period that comes after this is called the Ur-3 period. It's a fairly well known. When I say well known, I use that in sort of parentheses because the further we go back in time, it can get really cloudy, but it's fairly well known in the archaeological record. The most famous of the founder of the Ur-3 period was a king by the name of Ur-Nammu, who lived 2111 to 2094 BC. We're going to come to Abraham here in a moment, but Abraham was born about 2166 BC, and we believe that he left Ur around 2090, somewhere around 2090 BC or so. And this would have been right at the beginning of the reign of Ur-Nammu. Now, let me say a couple things about Ur-Nammu, again, just so you can give you some historical context. And the dates that I have for Abraham, there are evangelical scholars who have different dates of Abraham. There is a early Abraham, and that's the dates that I hold to. That Abraham was much earlier than what we think, based on some Old Testament internal text. I hold to the earlier dates, which places Abraham at the beginning of the Ur-Nammu or Ur-3 period. And then the latter believes Abraham lived much later than that, maybe 200 years to 1,000 years after that, or 400 years after that. But we have some other kings in this line. Oh, I was just say something about Ur-Nammu. Ur-Nammu basically drove out this barbaric group that invaded from the north in the Zagros Mountains. So if you look at a picture of Iraq, and you look to the north of Iraq, you've got Persia, or ancient, or it's Iran, or ancient Persia. And there were a group of people called the Gutians, Gutians, Gutians. And the Gutians culturally were much more, for lack of a better term, barbaric than the Sumerians. Sumerian civilization was fairly well, they were very refined, shall we say. They had a beautiful artistic culture. We see in the material culture is very artistic. And then when the Gutians invaded Mesopotamia and the city-states, they brought in this sort of very heavy-handed rule. So it was Ur-Nammu who united the city-states of Mesopotamia to drive out the Gutians. And he issued a bunch of reforms in Mesopotamia, and he was sort of like a Charlemagne, if you will, before Charlemagne. He not only did he drive the Gutians out, he also established law codes. In fact, we believe that the Code of Hammurabi was actually influenced by the Code of Ur-Nammu that we have record of as well. Not only that, but Ur-Nammu also built ziggurats. Ziggurats are stepped temples, these pyramids that look like it's not a perfectly smooth pyramid, but they're like stepped pyramids. And so in Ur, he built the great pyramid of Ur-Nammu at Ur. And again, this would have been after Abraham left. So Abraham left right as Ur-Nammu came to power, and he went up north into Haran. So just to give you some historical context background as to the time frame of when Abraham would have lived. He's living at the very beginnings of human civilization as we know it. A couple other names of these Ur-3 period kings: Amar-Sin, and then Shusin, and then Ibi-Sin. Kind of wonder about that sin. Of course, they don't mean sin in the same way that we do. It's interesting, their names. All right, so let's talk about the flood, and if in fact there was a flood. Oh, before I go any further, let me just stop and say, are there any questions about kind of the overview that we talked about so far? Anybody got any questions? Clear as mud, huh? All right. So it's just
Yep, clear as
remarkable.
mud.
Yeah. So it's really remarkable when you think about the Earth being covered in water. In fact, it is a water planet. So when you look at the Earth in the solar system, and not only the solar system, but in the entire universe, as far as we can see, as far as we know, scientists, researchers, explorers have not been able to find a planet that actually has water on it. And not only do we have a little water, we have a lot of water. And it covers the majority of the surface of the Earth. And the question is, was there a flood? The Bible talks about a great catastrophic flood that happened at the beginning of time. And if we're going to talk about the archaeological record, we've got to talk about the flood, and if in fact there was a flood. Let me just say, as before we sort of get into some of the evidences, something that I think is very important to keep in mind. This is just a general observation about just the facts of our Earth and where we are in the solar system. As you can see there from this photograph, and I wish in fact, I need to include this other photograph from Carl Sagan. Well, actually, Carl Sagan didn't take it. It was taken by Voyager spacecraft. Do you remember that photograph that Carl Sagan actually wrote a book? It's called The Pale Blue Dot. You guys remember that? It's a photograph showing the sun as a little tiny blue speck in a beam of sunlight. And it's just like a tiny speck. And I need to have that photograph in the next presentation I give. But it's really, really revealing, and it shows you the vulnerability of the Earth. The Earth is vulnerable. I mean, we are susceptible to anything. I mean, meteorites have hit, and we have evidence of this. We see evidence of this all around the world. So it's an open system, is what I'm trying to say, is that the idea of a global catastrophe is not just on the surface. Even if you didn't know the Bible, it's not crazy. It's very plausible that some major catastrophic event happened in the Earth's history. And I think as we begin to unpack this, I think it actually makes a lot of sense when you look at all the data, when you look at all the information. Again, this is not from archaeology, this is from geology. This is from earth science. So, local or global. There are strengths and weaknesses to both views. The view that I'm going to be arguing tonight is the global flood. And so the name of the game for global flood is something that, is sort of a term that was coined by, I think, flood geologist, catastrophic plate tectonics. So you guys may already be familiar with the theory of plate tectonics. Essentially, the Earth, let me go back to the picture of the Earth. The surface of the Earth is like a giant orange, and the the outer lithosphere is like that thin layer of orange peel. The majority of the Earth is under the crust, and that crust, that orange peel, if you will, can move around, and it has. And we see this all throughout the Earth. We see this under the oceans, which is a little bit thinner than on the surface of the Earth, and we see this all around the world. So the question is, what is catastrophic plate tectonics? Essentially, it is the argument that I'm going to present is essentially almost identical to what modern geology says is the history of the Earth. It's just sped up a lot quicker. So I follow the mainline view of plate tectonics, that the Earth, the continents were joined together at one time. There was a supercontinent, Pangea, some form of supercontinent. They were joined together. We can see this geologically, but they rapidly spread apart. Now, in typical geological plate tectonics, this happened over a period of millions and millions of years. This slow spread continental drift, they call it. And these continents are splitting apart. But catastrophic plate tectonics is the view that these continents split apart very rapidly. In fact, within the period of a year. And there's really good geological evidence that this is actually the case. And in fact, there are what's called cratonic megasequences that are found around the world. What in the world is a cratonic megasequence? Again, let me My computer's freezing up, so there we go. So a cratonic megasequence is a very large scale lithostratigraphic, big word, it just means basically rock layer sequence, lithostratigraphic sequence, that a complete marine transgressive recessive cycle called a craton. They're also known as megasequences or stratigraphic sequences or sloth sequence or supersequence or simply sequences. Again, this is all in the modern geological literature, these cratonic megasequences. What they are basically is geological evidence of sea level rising and then receding, thereby depositing layers of sediment onto an area of ancient rock called a craton. Places such as the Grand Canyon are a good visual example of this, apparent in the layers deposited over time. In the Grand Canyon, all of the mega sequences are visible in the canyon. So basically, if there was a global flood, then you're going to expect to find these major sequences of rock that are laid across the entire world. And that's exactly what we find in these mega sequences. So this is a cross section of the Grand Canyon. I'm not saying the Grand Canyon is caused by the flood. What I'm saying is that in the Grand Canyon, you can see on the walls these 6 mega sequences that are laid down all the way down to bedrock. So the very, very foundations of North America are found in what's called the Zoroastrian granite. So in the Grand Canyon, you can go down and you can actually see the very bedrock of North America found in the lower layers of the Grand Canyon. So what are the mega sequences? Here they are. This is the Sauk, the Tippecanoe, the Kaskaskia, the Absaroka, the Zuni, the Tejas. I think that's it. And so basically the Sauk would be the earliest flood deposits. And then the second, so it was the waters rising up and lifting up all the sediment and then depositing the sediment and then receding back. Because you got to remember, the flood was a year-long event. You've got the breaking up of the fountains of the deep in which the waters rose up, and then you've got the waters receding back. And so that's the names that they're given by the geologists today. You can actually look this up. These are all actually on Wikipedia if you want to look these up. These 6 cratonic megasequences that are found literally around the world. You can find these around the world. This is a map of the extent across North America of 2 of those, or 2 sections of those layers, the Coconino Sandstone and the DePete Sandstone. These are found one on top of the other. So some major event basically deposited all of this sand across North America, and it goes all the way up into Canada. And in fact, you can see this map here in the Grand Canyon covers 200,000 square miles, including the Grand Canyon, and it extends all the way out there. This shows you the extent of this layer, and it's found around the world. The sandstone lithosome includes DePete's formation in the Grand Canyon. So that means that this layer of rock was deposited first, and then it was cut through by some force after the flood in the Grand Canyon. So the thing about the Grand Canyon in geology is that it's not that the geologists are saying, flood geologists are saying that the cutting of the canyon. Think of a chocolate cake or a cake. You got the horizontal layers of the cake, you know, the horizontal layers, and then you get a knife and you cut down those layers. Well, the Grand Canyon is a cutting across of those horizontal layers that were laid across, and they must have been rapidly deposited because of some of the geological sequences or features that we see in those. And this is a National Geographic diagram of North America during the Middle Devonian, they call it. Essentially, they're basically saying that the majority of the United States was actually covered under a shallow ocean. And I would say even more than that. So what are the geological expectations of a global flood if there was a flood? You would expect to find these things: fossil sea creatures high above sea level, rapid burial and sedimentation of fossils in coal beds and other deposits, rapidly deposited sediment layers spread across vast geographical areas, sediment transported long distances. You'd also see rapid or no erosion between strata. You'd also expect to find strata laid down in rapid succession. In fact, it's exactly what we find in the geological record. In the Grand Canyon, again, this is those horizontal layers. What you see in the bottom there is something called a cross-bedded sediment. So this layer on the bottom, it was basically like a sand dune. Sand was going up and it was forming like a sand, like it would go over like round. And the layer on top cross-bedded it. In other words, it cut it off rapidly. And you notice there is a definite, where the finger is pointing right there, there is a definite boundary between the crossbed and the layer on top, which means that it must have been laid down in very rapid succession, not over a period of millions of years. If this was laid down over a period of millions of years, in that boundary, what we'd expect to find is what's called chemical erosion. We don't see it at all. This is an event that happened very, very rapidly. So this is the cross-bedded section of that. And another very mysterious section of the Grand Canyon, not only that in the Grand Canyon, but it's also across North America, is called the Great Unconformity. Again, according to traditional dating, not even in creation dating or anything like that, according to traditional dating, there is a billion, with a B, a billion years of time missing in between the Docks Formation below and the Tapete Sandstone above. And my friend there, Ting, is a professor of Greek out in San Francisco at Golden Gate Seminary. He's got his hand literally on the Great Unconformity in the Grand Canyon. And so, yeah, it's a problem for your typical understanding of geology. Also, we have in the Grand Canyon the folding in the tapetes, which means that these layers must have been soft when they were folded. And we see this in the tapetes. Also, we see it around the world as well. Now, let me just pause here, go a little bit of a rabbit trail. There is a bias in geology against catastrophic processes that affect Earth's history. That actually goes all the way back to Charles Darwin and the influence of Darwin's book on the origin of species. Now, Darwin relied very heavily on the geology of Charles Lyell. And if you know anything about Lyell, Charles Lyellian geology, basically it's a theory called uniformitarianism, which basically says that the present is the key to the past. So in other words, if you want to understand the present geological formations that you see, then you have to rely on what you see happening today, uniformitarian. In other words, things are remaining the same. And before that, there was a view of geology called catastrophism. And there was, in the 1920s, there was a very famous episode in American geology where this bias against catastrophism was really a black eye in the history of the modern American geological community. So Harlan Bretz was a geologist working up in the Pacific Northwest and primarily Washington State, in the scablands of Washington State. And what he wanted to do was to try to explain the Western Badlands of Eastern Badlands of Washington State. And basically what he showed was that this was the result of a catastrophic flood, but it was a local. There was a glacier just north, and there was a glacial dam. In other words, as the glacier began to melt, that formed a big lake inside the glacier, and the edge of that glacier burst, and all of those millions of tons of water came rushing out and carved the entire eastern scablands of Washington State in a matter of hours. So this is a photograph of the glacial Lake Missoula flood. The scablands that are there, the gray there, it's in eastern Washington State. This is where the proposed ice cork was. But when he published this in 1920s, this was at the height of the whole Scopes monkey trial, and Darwinism and all that. And now get this now, Brett was not a Christian creationist. He was not trying to prove Noah's flood. He was trying to show that the eastern scablands were a result of some major catastrophe. It was a local thing, again, formed by a glacial lake that burst, but it did show that you can have geological formations that form in a matter of hours and days and not millions of years. So this is really kind of a black eye on the scablands. They're basically cover 15,000 square miles in Washington State. You've got Palouse Falls, and you see there on this photograph, it sort of does look like the Grand Canyon, doesn't it? And it was formed in a matter of hours, again, or 1 to 2 days, not millions of years. So this just is a good example to show that you can expand that out on a global scale, and you can explain a lot by the global flood. This makes more sense. This is a quote here from Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard University. Brett stood against a firm, highly restrictive dogma that never had made any sense. The emperor had been naked for a century. Charles Lyell, the godfather of geological gradualism, had pulled a fast one in establishing the doctrine of imperceptible change. And then he says this: the establishment, as represented by the United States Geological Society, closed ranks in opposition. Instead of protesting Brett's flood on its own merits, they rejected it on general principles. And so actually, I got another quote. It's not on here, but basically what Gould says is that Lyell won with rhetoric what he could not win with data. So basically, they rejected the Brett's flood based on the fact that it sounded too much like Noah's flood, so they rejected it. He ended up being vindicated years later. So he was vindicated. Brett's was. Big question is, I get asked a lot, could the Ark have survived? I mentioned this guy earlier, Otzi the Iceman, found in Bolzano, Italy from the Neolithic period in the Italian Alps. You also have South American mummies in the Inca. You have woolly mammoths. In fact, there was just one found recently. Actually, it was a cave bear, and I posted on Epic Archaeology, and you can actually see that the soft material was preserved. So yeah, I would say that the Ark, Noah's Ark, could have survived if it was in the ice. If it's in ice, then things can be preserved rapid. In fact, dry, cold ice preserves organic material very, very well. There's actually a website, if you guys want to check this out, you can go to, just Google it, and that's a forensic reconstruction of what the Iceman very well looked like. It's discovered by hikers in the Italian Alps in 1991. Otzi the Iceman. Archaeologic sensation, media star, research topic, museum object. I think Otzi is actually, his body is in a freezer in the museum. But he had tattoos, and I believe he had some spear points in him. But this would have been after the flood, which we haven't talked about, but he would have been post-flood, after the flood. This is another example of how ice can preserve organic material very well. This is a woolly mammoth discovered in Siberia. You can see the fur, the red is still in the fur. That's the skin. I mean, the stomach contents are still, this is a baby woolly mammoth. There have actually been some scientists who have done some research on potentially cloning a mammoth and joining the DNA of mammoth DNA with the DNA of an African elephant. So I'm not sure if that's a good idea, if, like, you know, Jurassic Park will happen. As Dr. Ian Malcolm says, you know, evolution will find a way, you know, maybe the mammoth will turn into like a T-Rex. I don't know. I don't think so. But anyway, yeah, so that's geology. There's archaeology can't really study the flood. That's a question of geology, and those are some evidences I think that argue for a flood. Not only that, we also have some of the earliest accounts of a great flood in Mesopotamia. Again, would have been basically when the flood happened, the earth was radically destroyed. The only thing that would have been saved would have been Noah and his family on the ark. They would have came to rest on Mount Ararat, the mountains of Ararat. And as the earth began to rebound from the flood, what we believe happened is the earth went through a drastic period of climate change and went into an ice age. So and this again goes back to the earliest slides that I was showing you about the Paleolithic. This is when the archaeological record begins. The archaeological record begins when the earth was completely wiped out. Humans had to repopulate the earth. These would have been Noah's descendants. So as to how long that time period was, I don't think we can be dogmatic about it. But there was a fairly long time period after the flood in which humans, had to repopulate the earth. And that would have been during the Ice Age and during when the earth was cold. So as the earth began to warm up and get warmer, climates began to get warmer, humans began to settle down and build cities. So this transition from hunter-gatherer, in which they're basically hunting large game, such as caribou and elk and things like that, and then gathering nuts and berries and things like that, to animal husbandry, agriculture, then to urbanism. The first cities, then people began to live in cities, and the first city is Eridu, and that it begins in the early dynastic period. So this is sort of an overview of the earliest histories of Genesis. One of the earliest documents that we have of the flood, apart from the scripture, is the Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, that dates to 2100 BC. This is from the Ur III period. The earliest fragment is from the 18th century BC. It's Sumerian, Babylonian. Many of the elements of the flood story in the scripture, in Genesis chapter 6 through 10 in the Hebrew Bible, which was written in about 14th century BC, it could have been, and that could have come from oral tradition or something in Hebrew called the Toledot. It's a Hebrew word, which means this is the account of. So there is one scholar, I believe it's Donald Wiseman, who is an Assyriologist, who believes that the Toledot could actually refer to actual source material that Moses could have actually had with him, in which he was drawing from and writing the account of the flood and the creation account. But as of yet, we don't have any direct archaeological data for the Toledot. If there is some kind of source, we don't have it. The earliest written records of any kind of flood resembling the biblical flood is the Epic of Gilgamesh, and there's actually one that predates that called the Myth of Atrahasis, and they both accounts actually are Sumerian, and they match the biblical account almost to the detail. And then of course the Quran also in the 6th century talks about it. This is from the British Museum. This is the Tablet 11. It was translated by George Smith. It was excavated in Babylon, I believe, discovered in Nimrod, or where is it? Nineveh? I think it was Nineveh. Yeah, it was Nineveh. By Hormuz Rassam, who was a Iraqi Christian, actually. And he discovered this tablet, and it was set in the British Museum for quite some time until George Smith actually deciphered this tablet known as Tablet 11, dates to the 7th century BC. It's cuneiform. And there's actually I think it's a pretty decent article that we put out on Epic Archaeology. If you want to go to our website, you can go to epicarchaeology.org and look at, it's called Epic of Gilgamesh in the Bible, in which we talk about some similarities and differences. But in the account of the Epic of Gilgamesh, they mention the ark is a circle. And this could refer to a coracle or a kufa or kufar used in ancient Mesopotamia. So down in the Persian Gulf, around the marshes of the Persian Gulf, the earliest cities, and specifically Eridu, was irrigated. There was a lot of irrigation around the city, and they got around by these little circular boats that were covered in animal hides, known as a coracle. In the Babylonian account of the flood, the ark is a coracle, so this round thing. And so the reason I mention that is that it's a little problematic. It's kind of hard to fit every animal species on a big, giant, round animal skin boat. That would have been a miracle. But the biblical account of the ark is much different. This is a photograph of an old photograph of what that would look like. So that's a coracle as it would look. This is probably back in the 19th century in Iraq. The dimensions of the biblical ark are much different. A cubit, we believe, is about a foot and a half, almost 2 feet. The ark dimensions are 45 by 75 by 450 feet long. That's pretty large. It's total volumetric capacity of 1.5 million cubic cubic meters, or 56,361 cubic yards. So a standard railroad car is 2,670 cubic feet capacity. The Ark's volumetric capacity is 569 standard railroad cars. So we're talking about the Biblical Ark could actually carry a lot of stuff, And one other thing about the flood is the actual structure of the biblical account as well. Its form is in a chiasm, or a palistrophe. It points to, in other words, it's an ABA structure in which the entire flood narrative points to Genesis 8:1, which this is what it looks like. So you've got kind of a bookend sort of scenario here. We've got Noah in 10a, then that's reflected in 19. Then it goes all the way down into, it points to chapter 8, verse 1, and God remembered Noah. So you don't really see this in the English version of the Genesis account, but in the Hebrew version, this chiastic structure is laid out, and it's pretty remarkable, and shows you that the biblical writers were much different than the writers of Mesopotamia. One of the first artifacts that I think is interesting in connecting the earliest account of the flood with history is something called the Well-Blundell prism, or the Sumerian king list. Basically, this is written during the Old Babylonian period, so about 2000 to 1800 BC, and this may allude to the longevity of humans in the pre-flood world. When you read about in the account of Genesis, humans living to be, Methuselah living to be 900 years old, and Noah was 600 years old, and all the different descendants of Adam living to be hundreds of years old. Well, in this very earliest account of these kings, in fact, this document here, it's in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, the Sumerian king list. Basically what they say is that there were kings who lived, I'm going to paraphrase it, but there were kings who lived before the flood, and then the flood came and swept everybody away, and then the king's ship was established at Kish. And guess where Kish is? Eridu. And Eridu is where the Tower of Babel is, which actually what I believe is Tower of Babel. So we go back to the Uruk period and the Uruk expansion. This is to kind of show you again the time frame of this. We're talking about 3400 to 3000 BC. Where do we actually find? So think about looking for the Tower of Babel. That's sort of been after the flood. Is you not only have to find the tower, you also have to find the expansion. So in searching for the Tower of Babel, it's not so much just because there were a lot of towers or ziggurats. That it wouldn't have been a tower in a typical fashion that we think of, like a sort of like a cylindrical tower. It would have been a ziggurat. The earliest ziggurat is actually, the pre-ziggurat was at Eridu. And the earliest excavation layers at Eridu show a massive palace complex in which you've got a sequence of about 11 layers of building, one on top of the other, and then it stops. It just all of a sudden stops. And not only does it stop, but the people, there's archaeological evidence, the people living at Eridu, the pottery that they were making, and the material culture that they had, that just suddenly stopped at Eridu, and they expand out, and they spread out from Eridu, and they go north, they go south, they go east, they go up into Turkey, Armenia, they go into Egypt, they go into the south in Saudi Arabia, all the way over into the Levant in Israel. So we believe, I believe, and some of my colleagues believe that the Uruk expansion at Eridu is actually where the Tower of Babel is located. And this is actually a aerial photograph of the ruins of Eridu today. It's known by the Arabic name Tel Abu Sharain, and it's found in southeastern Iraq. It is an absolute wasteland. What you can see there, that sort of mound in the middle of the ruin, it looks like just dirt right now, but if you get closer, you can see it's actually a ruin. And when the time that it existed, it was a beautiful, lush, the Persian Gulf was a little further north, and it was a marshy, beautiful marshland. and the desert sort of moved in, and now it looks like the surface of Mars. It really does. But what you see there in the foreground in the actual little raised up platform is the ziggurat built by Ur-Nammu from the 3rd dynasty of Ur. So he came back several hundred years later after God came down and confounded the language and spread out the people. He came back and rebuilt on the ruins of Eridu and rebuilt the temple. And so the temple today, many of the artifacts laying on the surface today at Eridu are from the Ur III period. So this is about the time of Abraham. But the Tower of Babel predates Abraham by several hundred years. So this is another aerial photograph of Eridu today. This is on the surface. It looks like Mars, doesn't it? It looks like something in the Mars rover. I actually have a friend of mine who is a professor of archaeology at Yale University who went back in 2017 or 18, and he got to go. They had armed guards with them because it's in a sort of a dangerous region of Iraq, and there are literally artifacts lying on the surface. I mean, the site has not been excavated for decades. It's quite remarkable. This is a photograph that Matt took. They were there during a sandstorm, and it's just absolute desert wasteland. Pretty cool. There's Matt showing off his muscles, picking up that brick, by the way. He actually has a brick from the period of Ur-Nammu. I mean, it's just amazing to me that you can go to a place and find a brick from like 3000 BC laying on the surface. It's quite remarkable. It's pretty awesome. So let me give you a little overview of Abraham, the time of Abraham, the next historical thing we go to. Again, based on the chronology that I'm following, Abraham was born in southern Mesopotamia, in Ur, around 2166 BC. About 2091, he enters Canaan in obedience to God. And about 2080, Ishmael was born to Hagar. 2067, about this time, Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed. 2066, Isaac is born to Sarah in Gerar. 2051, Isaac is taken to Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. And then in 2029, Sarah dies at Hebron at the age of 127. When eventually Abraham dies in 1991 BC at Hebron. Again, this is the general time frame. Again, these dates are not arbitrary. They're based on internal evidence in the text itself. They're also based on the Exodus date of 1446 BC, which is based on a couple of texts, Leviticus, the Jubilee cycles in Leviticus, and then also 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, that talks about the Exodus happening 480 years after, or excuse me, yeah, the Exodus took place 400 years prior to the laying of the foundations of Solomon's temple. And so, so based on this chronology, we were able to reconstruct internally in the text itself when we believe Abraham would have lived in Mesopotamia. And when we look at those times, the historical time periods dovetail very well with what we know of the text in Abraham. It actually matches very well. So if we're going to find Abraham in the archaeological record, where do we begin? Well, the scripture says that he was from Ur of the Chaldees. He was also went up to Haran. There's something called the Amorite hypothesis I'll tell you about in a second. Also, we have possible historical inscriptions related to Abraham. We have not found his name. His name does exist in the ancient world, but we have not found what we believe is the Abraham. So we'll look at Abraham, the historical inscriptions, and then also the possible location of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then the camel anachronism, we probably won't have time to get to it. So the rise of the city-states in Mesopotamia, again, to kind of review, Eridu would have been the location of the Tower of Babel. It's known also as Kish, that's mentioned in the Well-Blundell prism. And by the way, I have a theory about, I have not really shared this publicly quite a lot. I don't think I've ever shared this publicly. So it's not completely harebrained, but I think it's there's some plausibility to this. But there's some debate among archaeologists, Assyriologists, as to the exact function of the ziggurats. So when I say ziggurat, again, I'm talking about the step temple. We know that it sort of maybe symbolized a mountain, and that there was sort of a building on top. Exactly what the function of the building was, we don't know. If there was a priest in it, or if they left offerings in it? We don't really know. And I don't really, again, there's no inscriptions that really say. But what I conjecture, my educated guess, is that if there was a global flood, and if Noah's Ark did survive somewhat intact, and we know from the Epic of Gilgamesh, and we also know from the myth of Atrahasis, again, I think they do contain some kernels of truth in them, even though they are old and corrupted. I do think they can still contain some elements of truth in them. Gilgamesh actually goes to the Babylonian version of Noah, a guy by the name of Utnapishtim, to seek the secret of eternal life. Noah survived the flood, and he was a really old man. So could the ziggurat be a symbol of Mount Ararat, and the thing on top of it, the symbol of the ark, and that the function of the ziggurat was to somehow, through some kind of magical means, try to, earn favor with the gods to have eternal life? The text doesn't really say. The text just says that they wanted to make a name for themselves, and they wanted to reach up a tower to reach the heavens. Just conjecture on my part, but I do think it makes a lot of sense. And we also know that the ziggurat was the precursor to the pyramid in Egypt, and the original pyramids would have been whitewashed to look like a snowy mountain. So pretty cool. Just a thought. You guys can think on that. Let me know what you think about it. Then we have Uruk, another very old city. Historic Gilgamesh was a king from Uruk. We do believe that there was an element of truth in the Gilgamesh epic story. Then Akkad, Sargon of Akkad, was again the biblical Nimrod. He united Akkadian and Sumerian people speaking peoples in Mesopotamia. And this would have been the old Akkadian Empire. Just to show you, you can see there on the map there, Eridu, right there in the south, right below Ur. See how close it is? By the way, I didn't mention this. Eridu was built on virgin sand. There's no, the earliest layers of Eridu, there's no earlier occupation of Eridu. It's just, it's the oldest city in the world. So pretty cool. And so, yeah, Sargon united all the Sumerian people. And this is what many scholars believe to be one of the early bronze carvings of Sargon the Great. His eye looks like it's been gouged out, but this would have very, very likely been the biblical Nimrod. Pretty cool stuff. I think we've already looked at this, some of the names, some of the kings. He was the founder of the Sargonic dynasty, Sargon of Akkad. Little interesting footnote, much later in Neo-Assyrian history, there was a king by the name of Sargon II. He named himself after the Sargon of Akkad, the great Sargon, and he was the father of Sennacherib. Sennacherib, you might remember, was the king that lived during the time of Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah. And he was the one to sack Lachish and to also surround and besiege Jerusalem. That would have been, and this is also in the archaeological record. We see the Sennacherib prism. We also see evidence of the siege of Jerusalem and also Lachish, or not Jerusalem, but Lachish on the palace walls of Nineveh. So he would have been named, he named himself in honor of Sargon I. Sargon II did. That was the father of Sennacherib. Ur-Nammu left, again, this is kind of review. I'm going to jump through this. Ur of the Chaldees, Ur-Kasdim, or Tel el-Maqatir, first identified in 1849 by Henry Rawlinson via bricks from a guy named William of Loftus. He brought to London. The site was visited. We have record of the site of Ur being visited by Europeans as early as 1625. It was excavated between 1922 and 1934 by Sir Leonard Woolley at the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania. By the way, Leonard Woolley was a colleague of another very famous American archaeologist by the name of T.E. Lawrence, Thomas Edward Lawrence, who you may know as Lawrence of Arabia. And T.E. Lawrence was a sort of a colleague of Leonard Woolley and excavated there. This is a really cool photograph of artist rendition of what the temple or ziggurat of Ur-Nammu looked like. And another little, again, mimicking possibly a mountain, you notice that the stairs all are in the cardinal directions. They go out to the right and the left. And what's interesting is that in the land of Urartu, in where Eastern Turkey is today, where Mount Ararat is, the local people call it the place of descent. It's the place where Noah and his descendants would have descended from the mountain. So again, just some food for thought as to the possible functions of the ziggurat, maybe perhaps as a faint remnant memory of this event in which the descendants of Noah came down off Mount Ararat. This is actually what it looks like today. This is the remnants of it. So it's fairly well preserved. You can see it's the base of it is still intact pretty well. Let's see here. Yeah, what time? Okay. So what I'll do is I'm going to show you guys a few more slides and then I'll stop because I'm getting a little hoarse from talking. I did an earlier presentation today, so I've been talking for quite a while. But Abraham and his culture, this is a really great quote from Dr. Eugene Merrill. Abraham and Ur of Terah and Abraham was quite cosmopolitan for non-Sumerians, such as Abraham's own Semitic ancestors, lived there and mingled their intellectual and cultural traditions with those of the Sumerians. Since by that time Sargon had created the Semite-dominated Akkadian Empire at Agad, nearly 200 miles northwest of Ur, Abraham was most certainly bilingual, commanding both Sumerian and Akkadian languages. So he couldn't speak Hebrew because there was no Hebrew at the time. Hebrew was very likely invented during the sojourn when the Israelites were in Egypt. And for more information on that theory, you need to check out my video, but with Dr. Doug Petrovich on Epic Archaeology YouTube channel. It's the episode, I think 2 or 3, I forgot which one it is, but it's the Hebrew as the first consonantal language, very likely invented by Joseph himself, the boy who was sold into slavery, invented Hebrew language, and it was the first consonantal language. So Abraham would not have spoken Hebrew, he would have spoken Sumerian and Akkadian. This is a really cool black and white picture of Sir Leonard Woolley at Ur, digging in his knee socks and wool jacket. Pretty cool. This is one of my favorite objects from Ur. This is the royal standard of Ur. It's early dynastic period. It predates Abraham by several centuries, but it shows you the culture in which Abraham came from. Very beautiful lapis lazuli inlay with gold and ivory. This would have been in the royal standard of Ur. And then also discovered by Leonard Woolley was this beautiful lyre of Ur, this beautiful musical instrument. So again, the Sumerians were very cultured and had a very high developed art tradition. Another interesting fact about Abraham, where he came from, the primary deity worshipped at Ur was the Sumerian moon god Nana, also known as Nanar, and in Akkadian as Sin or Inzu. So it's very likely that Abraham and his family were devotees of the very early, very same Sumerian moon god. There's also a potential connection between Terah, this is Abraham's father, Terah's name as a form of the Hebrew word Yereah, or moon. So Terah's name indicating his very devotion and affiliation. This is actually in the bottom, you can see there a cylinder seal of the worship of Nana, the moon god. So pretty cool connection there. God called Abraham out of a pagan culture and called him to himself, and he left Ur of the Chaldees and worshiping other gods to worship God, the one God, Yahweh. So in 2091, he leaves Ur for Canaan. He goes at the end of the 3rd millennium BC, sometime beginning of the 3rd dynasty of Ur. He goes, and in fact, when this happened, Ur fell, and there is a really good lamentation, a good inscription that you can read on the lamentation of Ur. I'm going to jump ahead here. Sorry, I'm going fast. I'm trying to wrap this up. This is a map showing you the Ur III Empire at its height. You can see there Ur at the very bottom right near the Persian Gulf. And what I want you to see here is how far this is. So the bottom finger is pointing to Ur. The top finger is pointing to Haran. Did you notice how far Haran is? It's way up in Turkey. And do you know how long this is? This is 600 miles. So when Abraham went to Haran, he traveled 600 miles. This, and also, I also on this photograph, I actually put a little symbol there for Mount Ararat. That's approximately where Mount Ararat is. So it's very interesting that Abraham was living in an area culturally in which he could have gleaned information about the flood because it was in fairly close proximity to Mount Ararat. I don't like super close, but within a couple of days' journey. So it was in Haran that Abraham met up with a group called the Amorites, and this is known as the Amorite hypothesis. Haran was populated with a group called the Martu by the Sumerians and the Amuru, which are the biblical Amorites. They were becoming the predominant people group in that time frame. So again, very likely Abraham became conversant in Amorite and Semitic dialects, and he also became familiar with semi-nomadism by the Sumerians or the Amorites as well. So basically living as you travel, because they had overgrown many of the city-states that they were in, and they were looking for new land. And so the Amorite hypothesis, I don't know if I got a slide for it, yeah, is the question of whether or not Abraham migrated south into Canaan with the Amorites. He could have went with the Amorites, or God could have told him to go by himself. I sort of tend to follow the latter view, but it doesn't affect it either way. Either way, Abraham goes down into Canaan, and we know that the Amorites also went down there as well. So he could have either went with the Amorites or he could have went by himself. We do know that there were massive people groups that were going south into Canaan. So let's see here. Hattusha, the capital of the Hittite Empire, was discovered in 1906 by the German archaeologist Hugo Winkler, and then eventually an entire library was discovered, 10,000 clay tablets written in Akkadian, Hittite, and Sumerian. In the Hittite library, you find the Hittite legal code, written about 1300 BC. This is a photograph of the site of Hattusha in Turkey, and this would have been the capital of the Hittite Empire. What's interesting about this is that in the Hittite legal code, it illuminates some of the cultural things that we see with Abraham. This is a quote from Gleason Archer, one of my heroes in Old Testament scholarship. He says, the Hittite legal code illuminates the transaction recorded in Genesis 23, where Abraham purchased the cave of Machpelah from the Hittite, I forgot the guy's name, I can't read it. Hittite logs explain the reluctance of Abraham to buy the entire parcel and his preference for acquiring the cave itself and the territory immediately adjacent to it. The law required the owner of the entire tract to perform the ritual duties of ilku, or feudal service. A responsibility doubtless included pagan religious observances. So as a Jehovah worshiper, Abraham would have been alert enough to prevent and avoid involvement by purchasing only a fraction of the parcel, leaving thus Ephron, that's his name, Ephron, responsible to perform the ilku, but because he was the original owner of the tract of land. So basically, this practice of dedicating the land to a foreign god, why did Abraham just buy part of it? Well, this explains why he would have bought part of it, because if he bought the whole thing, he would have been required under Hittite legal code, or at least that was the law of the land of the day, which very likely predates the Hittite discovery, that he would have had to perform this pagan ritual for having the land. So pretty cool. Then also Nuzi, Yorgan Tepe, located 12 miles southwest of the modern Kirkuk in Iraq. It was excavated in 1925 and 1931. Excavations yielded about 5,000 clay tablets from the Hurrian era, written in Akkadian. The Nuzi tablets describe, again, many social, economic, legal, and administrative affairs of the time. And the Nuzi inscriptions, like the other inscriptions, the Hittite legal code, confirm and illuminate customs and backgrounds of the biblical patriarchs, including Abraham, as well as possibly Job as well. This is a photograph of a cuneiform tablet from Nuzi. Middle Babylonian. It's in Akkadian. This is actually in the Harvard Semitic Museum in Cambridge. So let's see here. The selling of a birthright. In Genesis 12, verses 2 through 5, Abraham is referenced to Eleazar as the son of his house. The selling of birthrights was a common practice in the ancient Near East, and the Nuzi tablets actually give us insight into that. Also, the provision for a surrogate to produce offspring for an heir. So there were also laws in place that if your wife was not able to provide a male offspring, then the law of the land said that you could actually, the wife could provide a surrogate. So this explains why Sarah offered a Hagar, is it Hagar? Yeah, as the surrogate for Abraham to have the child. But of course, God was not going to use Hagar. He was going to use Abraham and Sarah. But what this shows us in these Nuzi tablets is that it shows what they were thinking. They were following the practices of the day. So, and then one other thing is Genesis 31, a plausible motive for Rachel's theft of her father's teraphim, or household gods. Whoever owned the household gods had the inheritance. So this again explains why that would be the case. And we actually have evidence of these clay teraphim portraying fertility goddesses all throughout there. In fact, we find these in the earliest archaeological layers in the ancient world. We find clay fertility figurines that have female forms. You can see the figures there, very kind of graphically displayed. But this explains why Rachel would have taken the teraphim, because whoever had the teraphim would have actually had the inheritance.